In this video, we're going to talk about exceptions. Specifically, we're going to talk about the syntax in C++ for catching and throwing exceptions. So I have a program that I've written, and I have a function quotient that divides two numbers, and another function mult that multiplies two numbers. And then I have a function called doStuff that essentially takes two parameters and then calls both of the previous two functions. So I'm going to initially call doStuff with 2.3, and we'll see what happens. And you'll notice it prints 2 times 3 is 6, and 2 divided by 3 is 0. Keep in mind that this is integer division. That's why you get a 0 here and not 0.66. So now let's do something a little more tricky. So instead of doStuff 2.3, let's doStuff 2.0. This should be okay, but this, as you can tell, is going to cause a problem. So if I run this, notice we get a floating point exception. And there's several different ways I can handle this particular exception. And what we'll do for this particular example is we'll throw an exception from this particular method. So we'll say if bot is equal to 0, then we're going to throw 0. Okay, so we're throwing a number, and you'll see where that comes into play in a moment. So this is not going to fix my problem just yet, and I'll demonstrate that. Okay, so we get a slightly different error, but we threw an instance of int. So we've actually thrown an integer, which if you're used to Java may be weird, because in Java you throw exception objects. Here you can throw any type. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this code inside a try block. And then I'm going to catch an integer e. And if e is equal to 0, I'm going to print So now let's run our code and see what happens. And notice I get this error warning attempt to divide by 0. And that's what I displayed here. I think possibly to clean this up, we might want to put an inline here. So that's one way to catch an exception. And notice that exception gets propagated to the caller. I didn't handle it here, so we're going to catch it in the calling function, which would be here. So let's add another of these calls. But here, instead of 2.0, let's do 39 and 13. So you'll notice I get the error here. It continues on because I've caught that exception. And you can see it does this result. But let's say that I think that 13 is an unlucky number, so I want to catch it. Well, I could say if, and I'll check both of them, x is equal to 13 or y is equal to 13, then I'll throw 13. So then in my catch, I'll add another catch. If e is equal to 13, then we'll say that you've attempted to use an unlucky number. And again, 13 really isn't an unlucky number. There's no problem from a execution standpoint for that. I'm just adding that as now that's logic of my code. For some reason, I think this is unlucky, so I'm going to throw an exception if you try to give me that information or that value. So I've compiled, and when I run, you'll notice I get the attempt to use an unlucky number. And notice here it doesn't even attempt to print anything because we throw this method before we actually try to call one of the other two methods that we defined. Whereas here, the exception happens in the actual function. It propagates to do stuff, and so do stuff starts to actually print these values. Then when it sees the exception, then it prints the warning. Okay, so let's do one other example, and this is separate from what we've seen so far. But let's suppose that we're going to define a vector, and I'll need to include vector in order to use that. And let's go ahead and print those values. So here's the safe way to print everything in a vector. Okay, so now let's compile and run this just to make sure that everything works. Well, we have a compile error, but fortunately it's on the last line of code, so that's always good. All right, so let's see. Let's run. So yeah, there's my vector. Now this is the safe way to do it. But another way to do this so I can do the first, well, 1,000 is probably too much. But let's do for int ii equals 0, ii less than 10, ii plus plus, and let's copy this. And we'll copy that line as well. So instead of ii here, we'll say vec ii. And when we run this, you'll notice, okay, so this looks good for 4 because that's how big it is. But remember, there's no bounds checking with vectors, and so it prints additional characters. Now, the way we do this to get bounds checking is we use the at function. So when I run this with at, notice I get an out of range error. And notice it's throwing an instance of standard out of range. So what we can do, and we want to think about where we want to put this. We're gonna put a try catch block, but we need to think about where, because if we just put it here, we're gonna say as that loop keeps going, it's gonna keep throwing that exception over and over. So we might want to actually do the entire loop inside the try block. And so now I can catch standard out of range. And then we can put some sort of warning. So now when I run this, and actually the reason here is that this should be, we should actually throw one value, catch on as a reference. So when I run this, you can see, hey, we get this exception and it stops because it catches it after the for loop. So when it gets this exception, the for loop exits, and then we catch the exception and it prints this message. And you'll notice I didn't give it a variable here because I don't really care about those specifics, but if I wanted to get this object, I could and do whatever I can with that object. So this is a quick introduction to the syntax of exceptions in C++.